The desert had swallowed them whole. 23 Marines pinned in a valley that maps would later mark as Grid Echo 7, surrounded by coordinates that meant death. Their radios crackled with desperation, voices tight with the kind of calm that only comes when you've accepted what's coming. The air support they'd been promised never arrived. The drones had been rerouted. The fast movers were grounded by a sandstorm 200 miles north, and the enemy, patient, methodical, was closing the ring. Captain Marcus Kine pressed his back against sun-scorched rock, counting rounds he didn't have. Blood traced lines through the dust on his face. Beside him, Corporal Deshaun Mills worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot a prayer that wouldn't be answered. They'd been holding this position for 11 hours. The ammunition was critical, water was worse, and the radio kept promising help that the sky refused to deliver. Then they heard it. Not the whistling scream of an F-16 or the thundercrack of an F-18. This sound was different, lower, meaner, a guttural roar that seemed to crawl across the earth before lifting skyward. It was the sound of something built for punishment, not speed. Something that belonged to a different era of war, when close air support meant danger close, when pilots could see the whites of eyes before they pulled the trigger. Hog inbound, Echo 7. Call sign Widow 6. Stay low and mark your position. The voice on the radio was steady, almost bored, feminine. That last part registered with a few of them, though later they'd swear they hadn't noticed, hadn't cared. But in that moment, with death measuring the distance in meters, some of them exchanged glances. Some of them wondered, an A-10, in this? And who the hell was flying it? Major Evelyn, Widow Cross, had been told to turn back twice. Once by her commanding officer, who'd cited weather conditions and tactical disadvantage. Once by her own wingman, who developed hydraulic problems and had to abort 30 clicks from the combat zone. She'd acknowledged both transmissions with the same 2 words: continuing mission. The Warthog cut through thermals like it was made of rage and rivets. Evelyn's hands moved across the controls with the fluidity of someone who'd stopped thinking and started being. She'd flown this beast for 9 years, through 3 deployments that the Pentagon had called low-intensity conflicts. She knew what the Marines below were facing because she'd been there herself. Not in the cockpit, before that, ground side, back when she'd been someone else entirely. The targeting pod painted the valley in shades of green and gray. She counted the heat signatures, estimated the enemy positions, and armed the gun. Radio chatter filtered through Kine's headset like static-laced salvation. Widow 6 were marked with orange smoke north side of the. His words were cut short by incoming fire, rounds sparking off stone inches from his head. Mills returned fire, his magazine running dry with a hollow click that sounded like a death sentence. Around them, the perimeter was collapsing. 3 Marines were already down. 2 more were combat ineffective. The math was simple and brutal. I see you, Echo 7. Danger close. How close can you handle? Kine didn't hesitate. All of it, bring everything. There was a pause on the line, just a heartbeat. Then, roger that, guns, guns, guns. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon was not designed for subtlety. 7 barrels, 30mm rounds, depleted uranium penetrators that could shred armor like tissue paper. When it fired, it sounded like the sky tearing in half. Evelyn squeezed the trigger and the A-10 shuddered, nose dipping slightly from the recoil, and the world below became thunder and dust and devastation. The first pass was surgical. She'd mapped the enemy positions in her head, calculating angles and trajectories while her aircraft bucked through hostile airspace. Tracer fire arced up toward her, green threads trying to stitch her to the sky. She ignored them. The Warthog could take punishment. It was built around the gun, armored like a flying tank, redundant systems wrapped in titanium bathtub plating. Pilots joked that you could lose half the aircraft and still limp home. Evelyn had never tested that theory. She didn't plan to start now. Below, Kine watched fire rain from heaven. The enemy positions that had been choking them for hours simply ceased to exist. Smoke and debris fountained upward. Bodies scattered like broken dolls. And through it all, that gray beast with its straight wings and twin engines kept coming back, kept making passes, kept putting rounds exactly where they needed to be. "She's not pulling up," Mills said, wonder in his voice. "She's staying low." Low meant vulnerable. Low meant every rifle, every RPG, every piece of antiquated anti-aircraft equipment could reach you. Fast movers stayed high, dropped their ordnance from safe altitudes, and disappeared into the stratosphere. But the A-10 wasn't a fast mover, and Widow 6 wasn't flying like someone who cared about safe. She was flying angry. The second pass targeted the eastern ridge where a technical with a mounted machine gun had been chewing through their position. Evelyn saw it, adjusted her angle by 3 degrees and fired. The cannon sang its brutal song. The technical disintegrated. The gun crew didn't have time to scatter. She banked hard left, pulling GS that pressed her into her seat, and immediately set up for another run. "Widow 6, you're taking fire from your 4 o'clock, someone called over the radio. She didn't recognize the voice. Didn't matter. Acknowledged, continuing. Her aircraft shuddered as something, small arms, maybe a rocket that missed by inches, rattled off her fuselage. Warning lights flickered, hydraulic pressure dropping on the secondary system. She compensated, rerouted, kept flying. The Warthog didn't care. It had been shot down more times in testing than most aircraft flew missions. It was designed to be broken and keep fighting. Like her, the Marines below had stopped shooting. They were watching now, necks craned to the sky, witnessing something they'd tell their grandchildren about in bars and living rooms and veterans' halls. Watching a single pilot in an obsolete aircraft hold the line alone. Kine keyed his radio. "Widow 6, enemy forces are breaking. They're retreating southwest." Not for long. Her voice was ice and iron, marking targets now. She'd already seen them. The enemy combatants streaming away from the valley, thinking they'd found escape in the broken terrain to the south. Evelyn descended to 300 feet, low enough that her aircraft's shadow raced across the sand, and began the most dangerous part of any close air support mission: the chase. Trees and rock formations blurred past her canopy. She flew with instinct, trusting her instruments and her hands and the years of training that had carved neural pathways deeper than thought. The targeting reticle danced over fleeing figures. She fired in controlled bursts, efficient, professional, merciless. This wasn't personal, but it wasn't not personal either. Years ago, when Evelyn had been Lieutenant Cross, fresh-faced and idealistic, she'd led a patrol through a valley not unlike this one. They'd called for air support. Help had come late. By the time the jets arrived, 3 of her soldiers were dead and she'd taken shrapnel that left scars across her ribs like angry fingerprints. The pilots had been professional, apologetic even, but they'd been too late. That lesson had carved itself into her bones. Distance equals death. Altitude equals abandonment. If you want to save lives, you have to be willing to bleed for them. So she'd switched branches, learned to fly, chosen the A-10 specifically because it was the only aircraft that fought the way she did, close, ugly, and unwilling to quit. Her squadron mates had called her crazy. Some still did. She'd collected her call sign after losing her husband to an IED in Kandahar. Widow. The name stuck. She'd made it a promise. The enemy vehicles were scattering now, breaking formation in panic. Evelyn selected her remaining rockets. She was running low on everything and made 4 more passes. Each one measured. Each one counted. When her weapons indicator flashed empty on the rockets, she switched back to the gun. The GAU-8 had plenty of hate left to give. Kine watched the sky with something approaching reverence. This wasn't air support. This was personal protection by someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned. Mills had stopped counting enemy casualties. The numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the gray angel circling overhead, engines howling defiance, refusing to leave until every single Marine was safe. Widow 6, this is Echo 7 actual. Area is secure. Enemy forces neutralized or retreating beyond effective range. Kine's voice cracked slightly. Professional discipline couldn't quite mask the emotion. You saved our lives. Negative Echo 7. You held the line, I just bought you time. Pause. Medevac is inbound 12 minutes out. I'll maintain overwatch until they're on station. She didn't mention that her fuel was critical. Didn't mention the warning lights painting her cockpit like a Christmas tree. Didn't mention that she'd violated about 16 regulations getting here and would face a formal inquiry when she landed. None of that mattered. What mattered was the 23 souls below who would see tomorrow because she'd refused to turn back. The sandstorm that had grounded the fast movers was moving closer now. Evelyn could see it on her radar, a wall of amber fury rolling across the desert. She had maybe 20 minutes before visibility became impossible. The medevac helicopter would make it. Barely. But her return flight would be flying blind through conditions that would make veteran pilots weep. Widow 6 weather's closing in, you need to RTB. The voice of her squadron commander patched through from base, concerned, almost fatherly. Colonel Harrison had been flying when she was still in diapers. Affirmative, sir. Departing when medevac confirms boots on ground. Evelyn, using her name now, not her call sign. You've done enough, come home. She almost smiled. Home, like that was a place instead of a feeling. 10 minutes, sir, then I'm RTB. Below, the Marines were already organizing for extraction. The wounded were being stabilized. Perimeter security established. Kine stood in the center of it all, one hand shielding his eyes as he tracked the A-10's slow circles overhead. He'd commanded Marines for 8 years. He'd seen heroism in 100 forms, but this was different. This was one person choosing to risk everything for strangers she'd never meet, for a mission everyone had written off, for a principle that most people claimed to believe, but few actually lived. The medevac arrived in a storm of rotor wash and dust. Evelyn maintained her circle, eyes scanning for any last-minute threats. When the helicopter lifted off with the wounded secured inside, she finally turned northeast, toward base, toward the storm, toward whatever consequences waited. Echo 7, this is Widow 6, you're clear, stay safe. Widow 6, Kine hesitated, searching for words adequate to the moment. Thank you doesn't cover it. It never does, Captain. Bring your people home. She didn't wait for a response. The A-10 dipped its wings once, a gesture, a salute, a promise, and disappeared into the gathering storm. The sound of its engines faded slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to leave. The Marines stood in silence, watching the empty sky, understanding that they'd witnessed something rare. Something that would define how they saw their service, their sacrifice, their understanding of what it meant to hold the line. Mills finally broke the silence. Who was that? Kine shook his head slowly. Someone who's been where we are, someone who remembers what it's like to be forgotten. He keyed his radio one last time. All Echo units consolidate and prepare for extraction, and when we get back, he paused, choosing words carefully, we find out who Widow 6 is. We make sure her story gets told. Nobody disagreed. In the business of war, debts are marked in blood and honor. They just accumulated a debt that would take lifetimes to repay. The storm hit 15 minutes into Evelyn's return flight. Visibility dropped to 0. Her instruments became her reality, artificial horizon, altitude, heading. The aircraft shuddered and bucked through turbulence that would have torn smaller planes apart. Sand and grit screamed against her canopy. Warning lights flashed in sequences she'd only seen in training scenarios. Hydraulic pressure in the primary system was fluctuating. Fuel flow inconsistent. She'd taken more damage than she'd realized during those low passes. She flew anyway, because that's what you did. You flew until you couldn't, and then you flew some more. The radio crackled with voices from base. Tower, approach control. The colonel again, personal concern bleeding through professional detachment. She acknowledged them with minimum words, saving her concentration for staying airborne. The A-10 wanted to fly. It always did. But it was tired, wounded, running on fumes and stubbornness, like its pilot. 20 minutes became 30. The storm showed no signs of relenting. Evelyn descended below the worst of it, flying dangerously low over terrain she couldn't see, trusting her radar altimeter and instruments and a kind of faith that didn't have a name. The desert below was invisible, a darkness that could hide mountains or flatland or death. She flew through it like a ghost, her aircraft's engines the only sound in the screaming void. When she finally broke through the edge of the storm, the base appeared like an island of light in an ocean of darkness. Her fuel gauge read below minimums. She had one chance to land, one approach. If she missed, she'd be ejecting over the desert and hoping someone could find her before the storm did. The A-10 didn't have enough fuel for a second pass. Tower cleared her straight in. Emergency vehicles were already positioned along the runway, red and blue lights painting abstract patterns in the dusk. She lined up, dropped landing gear that deployed with reluctant mechanical groans, and brought the Warthog down with a landing that would have made her instructors weep. Hard, fast, but on the runway. The aircraft rolled to a stop just past midfield, engines winding down with sounds like exhausted breathing. Evelyn sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still on the controls, not quite ready to let go. Adrenaline was leaving her system in waves, replaced by exhaustion that made her bones ache. She closed her eyes, breathed, opened them again. Through her canopy, she could see ground crew already approaching, fire trucks standing ready, the entire apparatus of military aviation mobilizing to receive one battered aircraft and its stubborn pilot. She'd made it, against odds, against orders, against common sense. She'd made it because 23 Marines needed her to, because turning back wasn't in her vocabulary, because some promises are written in blood and carved in sky, and you keep them even when everything says you shouldn't. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss. Cool evening air rushed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and desert and survival. Colonel Harrison was waiting at the base of the ladder, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She knew that look. She'd be facing paperwork, possibly a formal reprimand, definitely a very long debrief where people with clean uniforms and no combat experience would question every decision she'd made. She climbed down slowly, legs unsteady, and came to attention before her commanding officer. He studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of the reprimand she expected, he extended his hand. She shook it, confused. He leaned close, voice low enough that only she could hear. "That was the finest piece of flying I've seen in 30 years. Also the most reckless. We're going to have words, but first." He stepped back, raised his voice so the ground crew could hear. "Welcome home, Major. Well done." The ground crew erupted in applause. Evelyn blinked, startled, as mechanics and technicians and ordnance specialists who'd probably never spoken to her directly began clapping, shouting, celebrating. Someone whistled. Someone else called out her call sign. The moment stretched, surreal and overwhelming, until she managed a tired smile and a nod of acknowledgement. Colonel Harrison guided her away from the crowd toward the operations building. "The Marines you pulled out are already talking, words spreading. By tomorrow, every unit in theater will know what you did." He glanced at her sideways. "You're going to be famous, whether you like it or not." "I don't care about famous, sir. I care that they're alive." "I know, that's why this matters." He held the door open for her. Inside, the operations center was buzzing with activity. Screens displayed live feeds, radar tracks, communication logs. And in the center of it all, on the main display, someone had posted the after-action report from A-7. Kind's words, raw and unfiltered, describing the engagement, describing her. She read it silently, feeling something catch in her chest. The report didn't just detail tactics and timelines. It told a story about being forgotten, about someone who refused to forget, about what it meant when one person decided that lives mattered more than regulations. Harrison watched her read. "You violated standing orders, flew into conditions that grounded everyone else, engaged in danger-close support that violated minimum safe distances. By the book, you should be facing a court-martial." She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "But the Marines are alive, all 23, and sometimes," he paused, choosing words carefully, Sometimes the book doesn't account for the right thing. You're grounded pending investigation. But off the record, I'd have done the same thing. And I'm going to make damn sure the people reviewing your case understand what you saved. Evelyn met his eyes, saw respect there, understanding, the kind of recognition that comes from shared experience, from having stood where she'd stood and made impossible choices. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. You're still going to have to explain yourself to people who have never had to call for air support and heard nothing but silence, but I'll be standing next to you when you do. He gestured toward the door. Go get some rest. Debriefs at 0600. And Major, keep your phone off. The media's already sniffing around this story. You don't want to talk to them yet. But the story was already beyond containment. In operations centers and ready rooms and mess halls across 3 continents, Marines and soldiers and airmen were hearing about what happened at Grid Echo 7, about the A-10 that came when nothing else would, about Widow 6. Some versions were accurate. Others had already begun mythologizing, adding details that were more symbol than fact. By midnight, someone had leaked Kind's after-action report to military social media. By dawn, it had gone viral. Evelyn slept through the beginning of her own legend, too exhausted to dream. She woke to her phone vibrating with hundreds of notifications despite being on silent. Messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, fellow pilots, academy classmates, her mother, worried and proud in equal measure. She ignored them all and made her way to the debrief, arriving early in rumpled flight suit and yesterday's fatigue. The investigation board consisted of 3 colonels and a general she didn't recognize. They sat behind a long table in a conference room that smelled of coffee and tension. She stood at attention, waiting. The general spoke first, his voice surprisingly gentle. Major Cross, we've reviewed your mission logs, communications records, and testimony from Captain Kine and his Marines. We've also reviewed the tactical situation and the decisions that led you to disobey direct orders. Here it comes, she thought, the hammer. Yes, sir. Your actions violated protocols designed to protect aircrew and preserve combat assets. He let that hang in the air. They also saved 23 lives that would otherwise have been lost. This board is tasked with determining whether you should face disciplinary action or commendation. One of the colonels, a woman with aviator wings and a chest full of medals, leaned forward. Help us understand, Major. When you were ordered to turn back, what were you thinking? Evelyn considered her answer carefully. The truth was complex, layered with personal history and professional conviction, and something deeper that she didn't have words for. I was thinking that I'd been in their position, ma'am. I know what it sounds like when the radio goes quiet, when the help you were promised doesn't come. I know what that does to people. She paused. I couldn't let them experience that, not if I had the capacity to help. Even at significant risk to yourself and your aircraft. The aircraft is a tool, ma'am. Tools can be replaced. The Marines couldn't be. She met the colonel's eyes. I made a tactical assessment. The conditions were challenging but not impossible. My aircraft was suited to low-visibility operations, and the enemy presence, while significant, wasn't equipped with advanced anti-aircraft capabilities. The risk was acceptable measured against the outcome. Acceptable to you, another colonel interjected. Not acceptable according to our operational parameters. Yes, sir, I understand that. I also understand that operational parameters are written by people who aren't in the moment. They're guidelines, not absolute laws. And when lives are at stake, sometimes you have to trust your training and your instincts over a checklist. The general made a note on his tablet. You're aware that your actions could have resulted in the loss of a multi-million-dollar aircraft and an experienced pilot, that we'd have had to launch a search and rescue operation in the same conditions you were flying through. Yes, sir, I weighed those factors. And you decided they were worth the risk. I decided 23 Marines were worth the risk, sir. Silence filled the room. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the general sat back, his expression softening slightly. Major Cross, you put us in a difficult position. We can't officially condone what you did, but we also can't ignore the outcome. After deliberation, this board has decided on the following. You will receive a formal letter of counseling regarding adherence to operational protocols. This will remain in your personnel file. Her heart sank slightly. A letter of counseling wasn't a career ender, but it would affect promotion prospects, assignment opportunities. She nodded. I understand, sir. I wasn't finished. The general's eyes held something that might have been a smile. You will also receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. Your actions demonstrated exceptional courage, superior airmanship, and selfless devotion to duty. The citation will reflect that you engaged in sustained combat operations under adverse conditions to save friendly forces from imminent destruction. Evelyn blinked, sir. You're a hero, Major. You're also a headache. Both things can be true, dismissed. She saluted, still processing, and left the room in a daze. Colonel Harrison was waiting outside, a knowing smile on his weathered face. Told you I'd stand next to you. Come on. You've got a meeting. Another one. Different kind. The Marines from Echo 7 requested permission to meet you. They're waiting in Hangar 3. Her stomach tightened. This was somehow more intimidating than the investigation board. She'd saved their lives, yes, but she'd done it from a cockpit, at altitude, protected by armor and distance. Meeting them face to face meant confronting the reality of what those lives meant. The weight of that was suddenly overwhelming. Harrison seemed to sense her hesitation. You don't have to go if you don't want to, but I think it would mean something, to them. Maybe to you too. She went. Hangar 3 was normally used for maintenance, a cavernous space filled with aircraft in various states of repair. Today it had been cleared, and standing in the center were 23 Marines in formation. Captain Kine stood at their head. When Evelyn entered, he called them to attention. The simultaneous crack of boots on concrete echoed through the space. She approached slowly, feeling entirely out of place. These were warriors who'd faced death on the ground, who'd held a line when everything said they should break. She was just a pilot who'd done her job, but as she got closer, she saw the expressions on their faces. Recognition, gratitude, something deeper that transcended words. Kine stepped forward, rendered a salute that she returned. Major Cross, on behalf of Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, we wanted to thank you personally. You came when no one else would. You stayed when anyone else would have left. You brought us home. I was just doing my job, Captain. No, ma'am, you were doing more than that. A lot of pilots can fly. Not many are willing to bleed. He gestured to his Marines. We wanted you to meet the people you saved, because to you we might have just been coordinates on a radio, but to us, you're the reason we're standing here. They broke formation then, not in any organized way, just as individuals moving forward to shake her hand, to introduce themselves, to tell her in halting words what it had meant to hear that engine roar when all hope seemed lost. Corporal Mills, who'd been beside Kine in those final moments. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who'd taken shrapnel to his leg. Sergeant Chen, who'd been carrying a wounded private when the bullets started flying. Each had a story. Each had a moment when they'd thought they wouldn't make it. Each credited her with their survival. Evelyn listened, shook hands, accepted their thanks with a humility that felt inadequate. What do you say to people when they tell you you're the reason they're alive? When they show you pictures of families they thought they'd never see again? When they promise to name their children after you? She stayed for 2 hours, listening to their stories, sharing what she could about the mission from her perspective, answering questions about flying and the A-10 and what it felt like to make those passes under fire. The conversation was easier than she'd expected. These were people who understood risk, who knew what it meant to make hard choices in impossible moments. They spoke the same language, even if their wars were fought from different positions. As the meeting wound down, Kine pulled her aside. There's one more thing. The unit wants to present you with something. He handed her a small wooden plaque, handmade, rough around the edges but carved with care. It showed the silhouette of an A-10 wings-level gun smoking. Below it, an inscription, Widow 6, Echo Company will never forget. Grid Echo 7, 23 souls saved. She held it carefully, feeling the weight of more than wood. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just know that you'll always have a place with us. Always. She nodded, not trusting her voice. This was why she flew, not for medals or recognition or headlines. For this. For the knowledge that somewhere people were living lives they wouldn't have had without her, that children would be born, that love would continue, that the future remained unwritten because she'd refused to accept someone else's ending. The media storm broke 3 days later. The story of Widow 6 hit national news, international channels, military forums, and social media feeds with the force of a cultural moment. Video clips of A-10s in action were shared millions of times. Think pieces about heroism and military aviation flooded opinion pages. Veterans groups held her up as an example. Critics questioned whether glorifying combat served any purpose. Politicians referenced her in speeches about defense spending and force readiness. Evelyn watched it all from a distance, uncomfortable with the attention. She'd gone from anonymous to famous in less than a week, her call sign now known to people who'd never served, who'd never even been near a military base. Interview requests poured in. Documentary filmmakers wanted access. Someone had started a petition to have an aircraft carrier named after her. She declined almost everything. Let her actions speak. Let the Marines tell the story. She had no interest in being anyone's symbol or propaganda tool. But Colonel Harrison convinced her to do one interview with a military publication that promised to focus on the mission, not the mythology. She agreed, reluctantly. The interviewer was a former Apache pilot, someone who understood the world she operated in. They talked in a quiet office away from cameras, just two veterans discussing the realities of combat aviation. The resulting article would become one of the most read pieces in military journalism history, not because it sensationalized what happened, but because it showed the human being behind the call sign. She talked about her time as a ground commander, about losing soldiers and carrying that weight, about choosing to fly because she wanted to be the help that had come too late for her people, about the A-10 and why she loved an aircraft that everyone said was obsolete, about making decisions in seconds that people would spend months analyzing, about the mathematics of risk versus reward when lives hung in the balance. "Do you think of yourself as a hero?" the interviewer asked. "No, I think of myself as someone who was in position to help and chose to do it. The heroes are the Marines who held that line for 11 hours. I was there for maybe 30 minutes. But those 30 minutes changed everything. That's the nature of air support. We get the dramatic moments. The ground forces do the hard work, living, waiting, holding. I just gave them the opportunity to keep doing it." The article ended with a quote from Captain Kine. "Widow 6 didn't just save 23 lives that day. She saved the idea that someone gives a damn, that when you call for help, someone's coming. That's worth more than any medal." The publication ran it with a single photo. Evelyn standing beside her A-10, hand on the fuselage, looking not at the camera but at the sky. The image captured something essential about her: the weariness, the determination, the quiet competence of someone who'd earned every scar and still showed up for the fight. Requests for her to speak at military academies started coming in. This time, she accepted a few. Not to talk about herself, but to talk about what it meant to serve. About making choices when there were no good options. About trusting your training and your gut in equal measure. About remembering that behind every grid coordinate, every radio call, every mission brief, there were human beings whose lives had weight and meaning. She spoke at the Air Force Academy to a room full of cadets who hung on every word, talked about the day at Grid Echo 7, but also about all the missions that didn't make headlines, the quiet flights, the routine patrols, the thousands of hours of training that prepared you for 30 minutes of chaos. She told them that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and doing the job anyway. About caring more about the people you were sworn to protect than your own safety or comfort or career. A cadet raised her hand. Major Cross, if you could go back to that day, knowing what you know now, the investigation, the attention, everything that came after, would you still disobey orders? Evelyn didn't hesitate. Every single time. Because 23 people are alive who wouldn't be otherwise. That's the only metric that matters. The applause was immediate and sustained. But she noticed something else. Several of the cadets had tears in their eyes, because they understood, maybe for the first time, what they were signing up for. The weight of it, the privilege of it, the terrible, beautiful burden of being trusted with other people's lives. After the speech, dozens of cadets lined up to talk with her, to ask questions, to share their own stories of why they'd chosen to serve. She stayed for hours, giving each person her full attention, treating their questions with the seriousness they deserved. This, she realized, was perhaps more important than the mission itself, inspiring the next generation, showing them what was possible when you refused to accept limitations. One cadet, a young woman with a determined set to her jaw, waited until the end. "Ma'am, I want to fly A-10s. Because of you. Because of what you showed us was possible." Evelyn studied her for a moment, saw herself years ago, idealistic and hungry and not yet broken by the realities of war. It's not an easy path. The A-10 community is small. The missions are dangerous, and you'll face people who don't think you belong. "I know, ma'am, but you proved they're wrong." "No," Evelyn said gently. "I proved that competence and courage don't have a gender, that when lives are on the line, the only thing that matters is whether you can do the job. You'll have to prove that yourself, every day, every mission. But if you're willing to put in the work to face the doubt from others and from yourself, then there's a place for you in that cockpit." The cadet saluted. Evelyn returned it, seeing the future in that earnest face. Maybe that was the real legacy of Grid Echo 7. Not the lives saved that day, but the lives inspired to serve. The ripple effects of one decision cascading forward through time. Years from now, somewhere, another pilot might face a similar choice. And maybe, remembering this story, they'd choose to stay, to fight, to refuse the easy answer in favor of the right one. That's how traditions were built, how cultures were shaped. One decision at a time, one person refusing to quit, one promise kept when keeping it cost everything. The A-10 that Evelyn had flown that day, tail number 429, became something of a shrine. Maintenance crews painted 23 small stars below the canopy rail, each one representing a life saved. They added a name too, stenciled in white paint: Grid Echo 7. The aircraft became known throughout the squadron, pilots requesting specifically to fly Widow's Bird like it carried some kind of luck or blessing. Evelyn tried to discourage the mysticism. It was just an aircraft. She'd done what any pilot should do in that situation. But the mythology grew anyway, taking on a life of its own. Stories spread about the A-10 that wouldn't quit, about how it had taken fire and kept flying, about how its pilot had pushed it beyond specs and brought it home. Some of the stories were true, others were embellished. All of them became part of the legend. 6 months after Grid Echo 7, she was flying a routine training mission when her radio crackled with an emergency call. Army unit under fire, requesting immediate air support. She was 40 clicks away, low on fuel, scheduled to return to base. The situation was eerily familiar. She didn't hesitate, didn't even think about it. Just punched coordinates into her navigation system and pushed the throttles forward. Because that's who she was now. That's who she'd always been, really. Someone who answered the call. This time, command didn't try to stop her. They'd learned. When Widow 6 was airborne and someone needed help, you got out of her way and let her work. She arrived over the target area within minutes, assessed the situation, and began making passes. The engagement was textbook, nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines. Just professional close air support executed with precision. The Army unit extracted safely. She returned to base with fuel to spare. No investigation this time. No medals, just a quiet acknowledgement from the ground commander and a notation in her mission log. This was the reality of her job, she realized. Grid Echo 7 had been an aberration, a perfect storm of circumstances that created a story. But the real work was this: the routine missions, the quiet saves, the thousands of hours of being ready for the moment when someone needed you. She continued flying, continued training younger pilots, continued showing up mission after mission, year after year. The legend of Widow 6 gradually faded from national consciousness, replaced by newer stories, more recent heroes. But in certain communities, among Marines, among A-10 pilots, among people who understood what it meant to hold the line, the story persisted, told in ready rooms and mess halls, shared with new troops during their orientation, mentioned in briefings when discussing close air support, and what was possible when someone refused to quit. Captain Kine, now Major Kine, sometimes gave talks about leadership. He always included the story of Grid Echo 7, not to glorify war or violence, but to illustrate what happens when someone with the capacity to help chooses to act, when capability meets courage, when training meets moral clarity. He'd screen clips of A-10s in action, and inevitably someone would ask if he'd stayed in touch with the pilot who saved him. "We exchange emails occasionally," he'd say. "She's still flying, still refusing to accept that some missions are impossible. Last I heard, she was training the next generation of Warthog pilots, teaching them that the aircraft is just a tool. What matters is the person using it." Those training sessions became legendary in their own right. Major Cross didn't coddle her students. She pushed them hard, demanded excellence, and accepted nothing less than complete commitment. But she also taught them the things that textbooks couldn't capture: how to read terrain from altitude, how to communicate with ground forces who were terrified and desperate, how to make split-second decisions when every option was bad, how to live with the weight of responsibility that came with having the power to save or abandon. Her students emerged from her training as some of the finest close air support pilots in the military, not because she taught them fancy maneuvers or advanced tactics, but because she taught them to give a damn, to see every mission as personal, to understand that behind every radio call was a human being whose life had value. Years passed. Evelyn made lieutenant colonel, though she turned down opportunities for staff positions that would have advanced her career faster. She wanted to fly, to teach, to remain connected to the work rather than managing it from behind a desk. Some called it career suicide. She called it staying true to herself. Grid Echo 7 became a case study in military academies, analyzed for tactical decisions, risk assessment, command judgment. Students debated whether she'd been right to disobey orders, whether the ends justified the means, whether one person's judgment should supersede established protocols. The debates were valuable, Evelyn thought when she heard about them. These were questions worth wrestling with. Black and white answers were for people who'd never faced gray situations. On the 10th anniversary of Grid Echo 7, the Marines of Echo Company organized a reunion. They invited Evelyn as the guest of honor. She almost declined. Large gatherings weren't her style, but something made her accept. Maybe curiosity about what had become of the people she'd saved. Maybe a need to close a circle that had remained open for too long. She flew commercial to Camp Pendleton, arriving in civilian clothes, feeling oddly vulnerable without her flight suit. The reunion was held in the same hangar where she'd first met them. But instead of 23 Marines, there were hundreds of people, families, children, partners, parents, an entire community that existed because one pilot had made one choice on one day. As she walked through the crowd, people approached to introduce themselves. "I'm Rodriguez's daughter. I'm Mill's wife. I'm Chen's son." Each introduction was a revelation, a reminder of the mathematics of intervention. She hadn't saved 23 lives. She'd saved all of this. The weddings and births and futures that cascaded from that moment. Kine found her standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, overwhelmed. "Lot of people, huh? I didn't realize that one decision could mean all this." He gestured at the crowd. "That's the power you wielded that day. not just pulling triggers, preserving possibility. Every person here exists because you chose to stay. That's something worth seeing. She watched a child, maybe 6 years old, chase another through the crowd, laughing with pure joy. Rodriguez's daughter, someone had said. I was just doing my job, she said quietly, but the words felt inadequate. You keep saying that like it diminishes what you did, but that's exactly why it matters, because you saw it as your job, not as heroics or glory-seeking, just as the work. That's the kind of service that changes everything. He paused. They want you to say a few words, will you? She almost refused. Public speaking had never been her strength, but looking at the crowd, at the living testament to that day, she nodded. Someone handed her a microphone. The crowd quieted. Dozens of faces turned toward her, expectant, grateful. Evelyn cleared her throat. I'm not great at speeches, but I wanted to say, I'm grateful you invited me here today. It's easy to lose sight of why we do this work. The missions blur together, the costs accumulate. You start to wonder if it matters, but seeing all of you here, seeing the families and the futures, it matters. It always mattered. So thank you for reminding me why I fly. Why I'll keep flying as long as they'll let me. Because this, she gestured at the gathering, this is what we're protecting, not territory or ideology or political objectives. This, people living their lives, loving each other, building futures, that's worth fighting for. That's worth everything. The applause was thunderous, but what struck her most was the silence that followed, the moment of collective understanding that passed through the crowd. These were people who knew sacrifice, who understood cost. They weren't applauding heroism. They were acknowledging a truth. That service meant showing up when you'd rather run, staying when you'd rather leave, giving when you had nothing left to give. The reunion continued late into the evening. Evelyn talked with dozens of people, heard countless stories, tried to match faces with the voices she'd heard on the radio that day. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. As night fell and the crowd began to disperse, she found herself standing alone outside the hangar, looking up at the stars. Someone approached from behind. Corporal Mills, now a civilian with a wedding ring and the satisfied weariness of someone living a full life. Major Cross. Just wanted to say one more thing before I go. You don't have to thank me again, she said gently. I know, but this isn't thanks, it's a promise. He met her eyes. I'm a teacher now, high school history, and every year I tell my students about Grid Echo 7, about what one person can do when they refuse to accept that some people are expendable. I tell them about you, about the choice you made, because I want them to understand that the world changes one decision at a time, one person choosing to care, one person refusing to quit. That's my way of paying forward what you gave us. She nodded slowly, moved beyond words. This was the real legacy, not medals or news stories or case studies, but people choosing to remember, choosing to pass on the lesson, choosing to believe that individual actions matter in a world that often felt indifferent and vast. Mills shook her hand and walked away, joining his family. Evelyn watched them go, then turned her gaze back to the sky. Somewhere up there, right now, pilots were flying. Some on combat missions, others on training runs, all of them part of the unbroken chain of service that stretched back generations. She was just one link in that chain, but maybe, just maybe, her link had held when it mattered most. Maybe that was enough. She stayed at the base that night, bunking in transient quarters, too tired to travel. In the morning, she'd return to her squadron, to her students, to the endless cycle of training and missions, and the mundane work of keeping skills sharp. But tonight, she let herself rest. Let herself feel the satisfaction of seeing proof that her choices had weight, that the mathematics of her life added up to something meaningful. The years continued their forward march. Evelyn made full colonel, though she never stopped flying. She became something of an institution in the close air support community, the grizzled veteran everyone knew by reputation. Young pilots sought her out for advice. Ground commanders requested her by name when planning operations. She'd become exactly what she'd hoped to be, someone people trusted when things went bad. She was in her early 50s when they started talking about retiring the A-10. Budget cuts, modernization initiatives, the endless Pentagon debates about force structure. The Warthog was old, they argued, expensive to maintain, vulnerable to advanced air defenses. There were newer platforms that could do the job better. The arguments were logical, bloodless, disconnected from the reality of what the A-10 meant to the people it protected. Evelyn testified before Congress when the retirement plan came up for review. She wore her dress blues, chest heavy with decorations earned over 3 decades of service. The hearing room was packed with media, veterans groups, defense contractors, and politicians who'd already made up their minds. She sat at the witness table, uncomfortable under the lights, and delivered testimony that was later quoted in military journals and defense publications worldwide. The A-10 isn't just an aircraft, she told them. It's a promise that when ground forces call for help, someone's coming, someone who can see them, who can stay with them, who can put ordnance exactly where it needs to be without obliterating everything around it. Fast movers are impressive. Drones have their place. But when you're pinned down and dying, you want a warthog. You want a pilot who can see your position, who understands what you're facing, who won't leave until you're safe. She paused, meeting eyes around the room. I've heard arguments about cost-effectiveness and capability matrices. Those are important considerations, but they miss something fundamental, the human element. The confidence ground forces have knowing that A-10 pilots will show up. That trust saves lives. It enables operations. It's the psychological foundation of combined arms warfare. If you retire the A-10 without a replacement that provides the same level of close support, you're not just losing an aircraft. You're losing a capability that can't be replicated by anything currently in the inventory. The committee members asked questions. Some were genuine, seeking understanding. Others were theatrical, playing to cameras and constituents. She answered them all with patience, drawing on decades of experience, citing specific missions, explaining technical details in language civilians could understand. When they asked about Grid Echo 7, inevitably, someone always asked. She kept her answer brief. That mission demonstrated what's possible when you have the right platform and a pilot who understands the stakes. But it's not exceptional. It's what A-10 pilots do every day in less dramatic circumstances, for people who never make the news. The decision on the A-10's retirement was postponed, kicked down the road for further study. Evelyn returned to her squadron, weary from political battles that felt more draining than combat. She'd done what she could. The rest was beyond her